Thank you, Patrick. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming in on Friday to learn more about the NIST process. So we're going to start out by doing a risk assessment. I think I won't bother with introduction since you already know that I'm Kelly Dempsey-Wright because you were all at the overview session. So anyway, let's jump right into conducting a risk assessment, but we will just have a really fast review about risk assessments in the NIST process. 830 Rev 1 is the publication that we use for guidance on conducting risk assessments. And then we had our key terms. We know what risk is. The risk assessment is what we're going to do. So if you don't already know, you'll find out shortly. We have threats, what is trying to hurt us. And that's divided up into threat sources, the actual entity, and the threat event, so the action caused by the entity. And vulnerabilities, how are we vulnerable? How is our system vulnerable to let that entity come in and do us harm? So there has to be we have to be vulnerable in some way by, say, not having controls in place or not having gone through a risk management process. And then we have likelihoods and impacts. And so, obviously how likely is it that the vulnerability could be exploited, and what would the impact be if it was? And so an overview, basically this is the risk assessment in a nutshell. We determine our threats, we determine how we're vulnerable, we determine how likely it is, and we determine the impact. So it's pretty simple stuff. And again, like I probably mentioned in the overview session, we did not make this process up. This is a common way to conduct a risk assessment regardless of the subject that you're assessing risk of. So you could use this same methodology in your own home to decide if it's, if you should buy a new house or whatever. We talked about our approaches. Quantitative is the approach where we have numbers. We can add dollar amounts together, or we have actuarial data. We have cold hard facts across the board. And if we have that, we can do a quantitative risk assessment. But usually we don't have that information. So I don't know if I gave the example, but in this we thought we did, and we tried to do a quantitative risk assessment, and in the end we wasted our time and money because we didn't have enough actual numbers to actually do it. So 830 Revision 1 focuses on qualitative risk assessments, and that is where you're just making subjective judgments, hopefully based on good information and by surveying a good cross-section of your stakeholders and not just sitting in a room and trying to think of everything yourself. But in any case, that's how a qualitative assessment works, and that's what we're going to be doing today. And then we just give it names or levels like low, moderate, or high. And then you can also you can use, if you need something more granular, you can do a semi-quantitative, and it's not really quantitative in that these numbers are not meaningful. 17 plus 70 does not equal 87 when we do semi-quantitative. So it's just a way to make your scale more granular if you need that to help you prioritize or understand what your risk levels are. So we have a 3-step process here. We start by preparing and planning the risk assessment, and then we actually conduct it, and then we monitor it. So today in the workshop we're just going to be able to do steps 1 and steps 2, but in your own organizations, of course, you would continue to keep the risk assessment updated and monitor your findings and make sure that there hasn't been any changes to your risk. Okay, so when we prepare for the risk assessment, we do these 5 things. We identify the purpose. Why are we doing this in the first place? Where are we at is this our initial risk assessment? Is it our updated risk assessment? What are we trying to find out? What's the scope? Are we at the system level? Are we at the organizational level? Are we, how far are we going to go with the risk assessment? What assumptions are we going to make and constraints? Sometimes in the planning stage, we don't know all the assumptions we're going to make, or all the constraints we might have, and we might have to double back and add some things to what the assumptions that we made, because as we go through the risk assessment, actually conducting it, we might find some additional assumptions that we weren't aware of in the beginning, and so we would note that down later. But in any case, we try in the prepare step to think about what assumptions we're going to have to make and what constraints we have. The constraints are usually along the lines of lack of resources, not appropriate skill levels to do the risk assessment, things along those lines. Sources of information. We identify where we're going to get our information for conducting the risk assessment. So are we going to use information from US CERT or the National Vulnerability Database or the Information Sharing Assistance Centers, the ISACs, all of the above, whatever it is. So today in class, we're just going to use the tables that we have already provided for us in 830. We're not going to try, we don't have access to the internet anyway, so and it's already in 4 hours to do this whole process. We just don't have time to be going out and really doing that thorough of a search. So we want to make sure, though, that you understand that when you do your risk assessment for real in your organizations, that you try to use really is the more sources you can use for information, the better off that you're going to be in. The more thorough your risk assessment will be, and the better your results will be. So we identify those sources during our prepare step, and then we make sure of what risk model we're going to use. And we're just going to always use the risk model that we saw in the overview session with threats and vulnerabilities and likelihoods and impacts. And then when we conduct the risk assessment, we do basically what we've already said. We identify our threat sources and our threat events, and our vulnerabilities and predisposing conditions, and then we decide how likely it is that those things are going to happen. And likelihood has two moving parts: the likelihood that the event will actually happen, and then also the likelihood that if it does happen, that there will be an adverse impact. So it could be that an event, a threat event that you've determined is likely to happen, but maybe if it did happen, it's not as likely to actually cause adverse impact. So, and then you take those, you put those two together to come out with your overall likelihood. And then finally, we do our adverse impacts, and when we have the likelihood and adverse impact information, then we can make our risk determination. And that's when we come to the very end and say it's low risk, it's moderate risk, it's high risk, or it's 37 or whatever. Okay, uncertainty. So as we go along, we're going to be making assumptions. We might have information missing that we wish we had, such as hard, cold facts or financial data or whatever it is, or maybe we just can't find information about the specific system that we're trying to assess. Maybe people aren't there, maybe they don't have things documented, and so you can't get questions answered. Then you would want to note that down, that you were missing that information, and so because that caused uncertainty in the risk assessment, it'll cause risk assessment results to be less accurate than if you had that information. So it's important to note down, we made this decision, here was our risk, but we were missing this really important information. So that's going to be a factor in how accurate those risk assessment results are. And also, of course, you're making subjective determinations, you're making assumptions. So all of that should be noted down so that everybody's on the same sheet of music when they are trying to make decisions based on the risk assessment results. And then finally, as you would go along in your organizations, you again would maintain that information, you would keep taking a look at it. Did your risk factors change? Are there new threats? Or have things changed in your system that now you're more vulnerable? Is likelihood increased? Any of those risk factors, you want to make sure if they've changed and keep an eye on that. And then of course, there's also a circular action going on here as we go along in the whole risk management framework process, as we go through our select step and our implement step and our, especially when we get to the assess step, we might find that there's some more risks that have been identified, and then so we would double back to our risk assessment and make sure that we had all of that noted down. Okay, so if you would go now to your laptops, and if you, so you guys are going to, we want to open the file that's called State of California Workshop RA Tables.
Which ones?
State of California Workshop RA Tables. So I already filled out the purpose for you. I mean, again, you know, we're just, so, and let me say also before we even get started in this, not only now when we conduct our fake risk assessment, but later when we start going through the risk management framework, don't get bogged down in the details here. I'm just trying to show you the process of how it works. So don't get all, because in the workshops yesterday, people were getting really wound up around some tiny little factor and trying to make it real, you know, and and you know, we're just practicing here. We're just going through a mock-up. So just like I said, don't get wound up around the details and trying to make it, you know, super accurate. Just, you know, like I said, we're just trying to show you how the process goes and how you can, you know, you'd be able to apply that process to your own organization. So as we go through, like I said, don't spend a lot of time freaking out about whether or not what you've said is 100% accurate with, and in touch with reality. So I already did the purpose for you. We're going to be doing, we're pretending like this is our initial risk assessment, that we've never done one before on this fake system, and we're going to be trying to establish a baseline of risk. So where do we sit? What risk do we have right now before we've done anything else? And our scope is just going to be at the system level, so the scope is just our little fake system that we have, so we're going to stay right there within that scope. And so now we're going to try to make some assumptions and constraints and figure out what they might be. Right off the bat, it's hard to tell. Like I said, you might have to double back and fill in the assumptions later. Can we think right now about any assumptions that we might be making? Oh, and I should also tell you that we're going to be working with our fake system here. If you wanted to open that up and look at it, it is the RMF Workshop Practices, a practice system. So you can see that it's kind of a all-encompassing general purpose system. We've got servers, we've got remote access via VPN, we've got firewall, we've got switches and routers, so we've got our networking stuff here. We've got laptops and desktops, we've got network printers, we've got smart UPS that's IP addressable, and we've got some wireless access there. So, so this is the system we're going to be working with today. So, can we make any assumptions before we get started, or do we know any constraints that we might have? Do we have enough resources?
We can make an assumption that all system components are functioning and updated.
Okay. All right, we can make that assumption because we don't know. So we'll assume that that everything's updated and everything's operational already. We can make that assumption. Can we make any assumptions about conducting the risk assessment itself? You know, I don't know. I can't think of any right now myself. So let's move on to constraints. Do we have the right skill levels that we need? Do we have everybody we need? Or you know, or do we only have one subject matter expert, such as ourselves, and then we don't really have anyone else to help us that has any idea about information security? Is that an issue we might face at our own organizations? So that might be an assumption that we have lack of skill levels to conduct the risk assessment with us. Because again, we don't want to do it by ourselves, so we still want to talk to the other people who aren't security practitioners, but but we know that they don't have a security focus and they don't really understand security, but we still want to talk to them about how the system is working and what it does so that we can better ascertain what the risk might be. But anyway, so that might be a problem, lack of resources, lack of skill on our risk assessment team. So why don't we note that down as a constraint right now?
Short time window.
Short time frame, that's a good one. We might have to hurry up. Maybe we only, we have to get this done in a month or a week or whatever, So, and you can see when we start going through here, it could take a long time if it's, especially if it's a large system. So, time constraint is a good one. So let's say we only have 3 days to get this finished and turned in, yes.
What about certain business folks that would be impacted?
Right, good one, that's right. So you might have operational issues that you can't, there's certain things you can't do or look at, certain places you can't go to take a look at what's happening in there because of operational constraints. Budget constraints, absolutely. I think we all have that. That might be the cause of why you have to hurry up and get it done in a short time frame.
How about focus and continuity, where you have to break it up because you have other priorities that interrupt the assessment?
That's excellent. That's right. Good one. So you can't focus on this solely. You have other duties that you have to do, and you can only spend an hour or two a day if you're lucky, if no fires are needed to be put out. So you might definitely have some time constraints there in that you're not able to focus on this. So maybe it's going to be all choppy, and also you'll be wasting time. What did I do yesterday? What did I say? You'll have to be reviewing all the time. So those are all excellent constraints. And then uncertainties. Again, uncertainties are we didn't make any assumptions yet, but we might, later we might find again that we're missing some information or that we do make some assumptions. So we might have to double back and fill in, and we probably will have to fill in the uncertainty column. So as we go through and we start actually conducting the risk assessment, let's try to keep in mind when we make an assumption or when we have some uncertainty, when we wish we had some information that we don't have, and try to remember to double back to our prepare area and fill that in. Yes, sir.
So for example, given that a lot of organizations have data documentation, we may have a documentation of the system, but it may be several years old and may be out of date, so we may have some uncertainty as to, is this really
Accurate.
Representative of what we're assessing?
Absolutely. That could definitely create some uncertainty. And with that, you might, and that might be an assumption you have to make. Maybe you have no choice but to assume that this is accurate. And so that not only is an assumption, but also definitely creates uncertainty. So absolutely. So good thoughts. Yes, ma'am.
Are we making notes on the document as we
You
go?
can if you like. It's right, it's not necessary at this time, but later when we, thank you. Thank you, my lovely assistant. Later when we start going through the tables, you might want to jot it down. I mean, it's not 100% necessary, but anyway, so that's just kind of the process you go through. And again, it's a talking process. It's a subjective process. You're just trying to talk it through, and that's why you need other people to help you. Because look at all the different inputs that we had, and I couldn't think of all of those things myself. You guys came up with those things, so it's really important to have some other compadres to go over things with and hash it out with you. And then our risk model, we're going to do the semi-qualitative. So when we get into the tables, you're going to see that NIST, in the NIST tables and the appendixes in 30 Rev 1, they give you some choices. They have in one column just the straight qualitative values of high, moderate, and low. And I think there's also very high and very low. But anyway, just those straight up qualitative values. And then there's another column with the ranges of like 1 through 10, 11 through whatever. And then there's another column with like just 1, 2, 3, 4. that sort of a range. So we're going to pick that middle range and use that 1 through 10, and whatever the numbers are, you'll see when you get into your tables. So we're going to use that semi-qualitative range when we start actually filling out our tables today. So we've made that decision that this is the risk model that we're going to use. And then we have to decide our information sources. So what do we have at our disposal besides those things that I mentioned that are external sources? What might you guys have? And remember, those were like US CERT, the ISACs, the NIST MBD. Do you guys have anything in your internal organizations, any documentation or reports or things along those lines that you might be able to use as a source for finding out about threats and vulnerabilities?
Can you count stuff like if you have Metasploit or an expose or something like that?
If you've done some sort of a
Okay.
scan or,
Right.
is that what you mean?
Yes.
Yes, sure, yeah. Well, you might want to use that as input anyway, yeah, into
Okay.
your risk assessment, sure.
A previous risk audit?
Absolutely. If you've had an audit and you've got an audit report that someone's given you, you absolutely, definitely want to take that into consideration. Another thing you might be able to look at is log. You might be able to get log files, see what's been going on in there, see if you can find some nasties happening in your log file. Anything else anyone can think of?
So if you use tools that you scan like any changes to, either through new development, like so changes to the system, would you use those as possible input sources then?
Yeah, if it's
During the system
documented.
development life cycle and all that? if you're using
Yeah,
that?
definitely, yeah. Design documents, anything that you have left over from any of your phases. I mean, any documentation you can get your hands on to help you do a realistic, risk assessment where you can really see.
So both manual and automated process, tools and processes.
Absolutely, yeah. Whatever the more information you have, knowledge is power and all of that stuff. So the more information you have, the better off you're going to be, and the more accurate your risk results are going to be. So that was good discussion there on the sources. So let's go ahead and scroll down and actually start conducting our risk assessment. So the first thing we have to do is identify our threat sources. So what are the entities that are threatening us? And we can see here that we have a row for adversarial type of resources, and then so we have insiders, or we have just individuals, then that can be insiders, outsiders, trusted insiders, and privileged insiders. So that might be a very narrow difference there. But anyway, we have groups. We might have a group that's just formed to ad hoc to go at us, or maybe we have established groups. We have organizations that might have an axe to grind with us. As government, we don't really deal with competition too much, but and then we might certainly have nation states looking to get our information or do us harm. So those are our adversarial types of threats. Of course, we know that insiders can do the most damage because they're already in there. They've got at least some level of authorized access, so they don't have to go through all of those other hacking steps to even get in. They're already in. So even if we have a hard, crunchy exterior, that's not going to help us against insider threats. And then we have our non-adversarial threats. We have inadvertent type threats, accidental. They didn't do it on purpose, but it still caused a big, giant problem. And those can be caused by users or privileged users. And then we have structural problems, equipment failures and so on. So especially if our equipment's old or we're using a lot of legacy equipment and software, that can be a threat in itself, and probably is. We've got environmental problems. Maybe we can't keep our computer operations center at the appropriate temperature because of the building's old, who knows. And then of course we have our environmental issues, fires, floods, earthquakes, those sorts of things. So let's go ahead in our groups right now and get together as a group and determine 2 adversarial threats and 1 non-adversarial threat source that we have trying to attack our fake system. And remember that the threat sources are going to be tied to threat events, which we're going to look at next. And then we're going to look at how is our system vulnerable to those specific threats that we determine right now. So go ahead and take no more than 10 minutes to come up with 3 threat sources, 2 adversarial and 1 non-adversarial. Okay, so if we have our threat sources, then without further delay, we will try to come up with the threat events that those threat sources can cause. Let me go down here to table D7. So for our 2 adversarial threat sources, we want to enter them into table D7. And the identifier column is just for you to put an identifier on it. As you go through the rest of the tables, there's always a column for identifier, so you don't always have to keep repeating which threat it is. You can just call it threat 1, or threat whatever. You can label it however you want in the identifier. That's just there for your convenience. And as always, these tables, you don't have to use these. You can modify them. You can add columns. You can remove columns. You can do whatever you want. This is just a starting point for you to help guide you through the process, so you can do any kind of modifications that you need. But the in scope column, it just means you might end up going and putting some threat sources down here, and then after discussion or after talking about your threat events, you might double back and put that it's not really in scope. Maybe it's not at the system level. Maybe it's just not really a threat in the end after you look at threat events and vulnerabilities. And then also with adversarial threat sources, we want to try to the best that we can. And again, here's where some assumptions are going to come into play. But we try to determine the capabilities, intents, and what is the adversary targeting. And we try to note that down also in table D7. And then to help us with that, we have tables D3, D4, and D5, I think. So in table D3, we see a scale about how to rate our adversary's capability. Do they have the knowledge and the resources to make them a capable threat source? So we can just give that a rating. And again, we don't, a lot of times, most of the time, we probably don't know for sure. So we're definitely making an assumption here. And then we look at the adversary's intent. And again, we try to give it a rating. And don't forget, we're using the semi-quantitative scale here in the middle. So this is a scale we're going to use because that's what we said we were going to do in our scope. So we stick to that. And we don't change it as we go along. So go ahead and try to decide about your adversary's capability, intent, and what is adversary targeting using tables D3, 4, and 5. And then for your non-adversarial threat, we have the range of effects.
Are we using numbers or?
We're using the middle semi-quantitative scale. So go ahead and try to fill those out, the capabilities, intent, and targeting for your adversarial threats, and then your range of effects for your non-adversarial threat. Go ahead and enter all of that into table D7.
So their agencies to serve their model simply because.
So just take another 5 minutes or so to try to do that. Oh, sorry, table D7 for adversarial, table D8 for your non-adversarial.
Activist.
Wait, are we talking about
So let's talk now about our threat events. So we identified those threat sources, whatever they were, our adversarial threat sources,
Are we doing it?
our insiders,
See, I-
etc. And so now we want to tie those threats.
Yeah, not intent.
Remember,
Assessing this not.
So capability was.
remember in the overview when I talked about how there was a many-to-many relationship between the threat sources and the threats and the vulnerabilities. So here's where we're going to see how that works. We're going to look at tables. So we're going to identify our threat events that can happen from the threat sources. So we're not picking random threat events. We're picking threat events that stem from the threat sources that we already identified. So we said, and we entered in tables D7 and D8 what those threat sources were: insiders, buyers, whatever, partners, nation states, whatever the threat sources were. We know what we feel we know what those are now. Now we're going to decide what threat events could those threat sources cause. So again, we're not just randomly picking threat events from the threat table, the threat event table. We're picking threat events, trying to figure out, I shouldn't say picking, we're trying to determine what threat events that those threat sources could cause us. So make sure there's a linkage there, and again, it's not random. And again, when you do your risk assessment for real, then you'll have a lot more threat sources and a lot more threat events that you'll be determining. But for now, just tie the threat sources that you already selected to threat events. Now in tables E2, table E2 is a big giant table of adversarial threat events, and some MITRE actually provided that table to us. It has its ups and downs. I'm not saying I could have done better, but but some of them are just so broad as to be not useful. So, but anyway, it's a very large table that you can select adversarial threat events from. If you can think of other threat events that aren't on that table that are more relevant to your situation or to the threat source, then absolutely use your own ideas. And then, so look at table E2 for your adversarial threat events. Enter the information in table E5. What's table E3? So this table, the adversarial threat event table, is quite lengthy, a couple of pages long. Okay, E3 is your non-adversarial threat events, so same sort of thing. And then table E4, okay, is relevance. So for all of our events, our threat events, we want to try to make a determination what the relevance is. So I think relevance is kind of close to likelihood myself, but let's go ahead and try our best to determine a relevance and enter all of that information into table E5. And you can see in these tables where you enter your information, I reference where you should be getting that information, what tables that information should be coming from.
And I have a security background, but it's always the threat analysis. It's not jumping in actually doing something. It's telling other people to do something.
Okay, let's move on, if we may, to vulnerability. So, do we have our threat events? Okay, so now we're still making ties. We're still keeping our linkages. We have our threat sources. They caused X number of threat events, and by the way, the many-to-many, a given threat source could cause multiple threat events, right? So maybe you didn't do that now, but when you are in your, doing your actual risk assessment, make sure that you get, you know, all the relevant threats that, that a given threat source could initiate. And then, now we're going to see how is our system vulnerable. So vulnerability, you know, is if you said your threat was an insider threat, how would your system be vulnerable to an insider threat? What would be the vulnerability that you might have there? It might be that you haven't done good background checks. So I like to try to tie vulnerabilities to controls that aren't in place. So normally, when you bring someone on board, you would want to do some sort of a background check and see, you know, what's up with these people before you give them access to your system. So maybe you don't have a robust system for background checks in place. So that could be, if that's the situation in your organization, that could be a vulnerability that leaves you open to insider threats. Or maybe you don't have good access controls in place or good least privilege processes in place. So, you know, maybe your insiders, maybe everybody has privileged access. You know, let's hope not, but but the point is that's a vulnerability. So don't get mixed up. You know, think of vulnerabilities in terms of controls that you could have in place, but unfortunately you do not, and that is how you're vulnerable. So don't get confused between threats and vulnerabilities. So vulnerabilities are specific ways that you're vulnerable because of lack of some sort of a control or countermeasure. So so we're going to try to make those determinations. There's not actually a table to help you out with that, so because it's really system specific and organization specific, so you have to try to think. So we don't want to be thinking of our own systems in our offices because everybody's, and you know, unless perhaps you're from your own, all from the same office, but you know, we don't want, just for the sake of the group effort, we want to be thinking of our fake system and not how is our own actual system at work vulnerable, but how might our fake system that we saw earlier be vulnerable to the threat sources and threat events that you already determined. So try to keep it in that context when you're thinking of your vulnerabilities.
Yes.
And again, also don't get wound up about the details. You know, just try to think of something reasonable and learn how to go through the process. And we're not trying to make this an actual risk assessment. And then we also want to determine the severity of the vulnerability. How bad is it? You know, is it just a mild problem, or is it a pretty nasty problem, like such as if everybody had administrator privileges? I would call that a severe problem. And so enter that, and there is a table F2 for that, and enter that information in table F3. And then we have our predisposing conditions. And these are kind of, they're not really, I have some notes here about it. So you can see that some examples about predisposing conditions. They are not vulnerabilities per se, they could be, but maybe you have none is an acceptable answer for predisposing conditions. Maybe you don't have any. There aren't necessarily, there's not a predisposing condition for every, you know, vulnerability. But just maybe you're in a geographic location that predisposes you. Maybe you have operational requirements or mission requirements that predispose you. Like if you're a university and you have to be open, you can't lock things down. You have to leave your firewalls open, that sort of thing.
There's no F1 table here.
Right, you're right, I'm sorry. That's a typo, so that should be F2, table F2. Sorry about that. And also, since we're pointing out errors, there is a table F4 that has to do with predisposing condition. It's one of those scale tables, so for some reason that slipped through the cracks and I did not include that in the Word table document, but that's not the end of the world, so just don't focus on that. And also, here's also where you would use a lot of, we talked earlier about our sources. We talked about output from vulnerability scans, our log event files. These are some, when we see here to enter the source of the information, you know, that's what we're talking about. And when we're talking about vulnerabilities, that's where you would get a lot of good information about where your system might be vulnerable from those types of reports, or possibly even previous audits or things like that. So you can, you know, pretend like you have that information, and that would help you so that you're not just trying to come up with vulnerabilities off the top of your head when you do it in reality.
Okay, so.
Okay, let's go ahead and talk about likelihoods. So we've determined what our threat sources were, what threat events could be caused by those sources, how is our system vulnerable to those threat events. And so now we have to try to determine how likely is it that the threat event is going to take place. And we have two moving parts here. We have the likelihood of event initiation or occurrence. So how likely is it that this is actually going to happen? So, you know, if it's a fire, you know, we don't, I mean, fires happen, of course they do, but we don't really see them that often. So maybe the likelihood is low there. It probably is. Hopefully it is. And then when we come to likelihood of adverse impact, though, if there is a fire, the adverse impact could be great. It could be high, or at least moderate. Especially if our vulnerability to fire was that we didn't have a fire suppression system in place. So we determine both of those things with respect to the threat events, and then we have a little matrix table that helps us combine those two. So, you know, if we said low and high, it's moderate, you know. So we're going to look at those tables now and determine our likelihoods. So we see that the likelihood, and we have different scales and tables here for adversarial and non-adversarial. So be sure you're using the right scale depending on what type of event you're looking at. And so look at those tables and decide about the likelihood of occurrence. And enter that into, I guess it must be G6. Yep. And then once you have that information, then determine again for okay, so it's just one table for the likelihood of the threat resulting in adverse impact. Get your determination there. And you can see it's tied, so if we're using these numbers here and we picked 57, then that's going to translate to moderate. So when we go to our matrix, we know what we're looking at if we've used those that range of numbers. But anyway, so again, if we said that our likelihood of a threat event, our threat occurrence of a fire is low, but the impact is, let's say, high, then we meet here and we have a moderate likelihood overall. Okay? So go ahead and do that with your threat events.
Okay, so we said we had a
You guys okay with the Okay, let's move on. Did we get our overall likelihoods? We did? Everybody's got their overall likelihoods determined? So now we get to decide and determine our impact. So if we, now and remember, risk is a function of likelihood and impact. So when we get to risk, we're going to see another matrix table where we're going to take our overall likelihood and combine that with our impact that we're going to determine right now to come up with our final risk. So In table H2, we have some examples of adverse impacts. So we want to take a look at that table. And then we have another scale about impacts of threat events. So we want to use that scale, and we want to enter the information that we determined from tables H2 and H3 into table H4 about our impacts. And we can see that the scale here, if you're going to say an impact is very high, you can see that the impact would have to be multiple severe or catastrophic adverse impacts. So, you know, when we are doing impacts now and later, when we look at impacts again with our categorization in Risk Management Framework Step 1, watch out, use that high impact judiciously. I mean, don't get overzealous that something is high impact, because a lot of times it might seem like it is, but catastrophic can be catastrophic. That is really, you know, yeah, death, you know, the collapse of the state government. I mean, you know, maybe not, I mean, that obviously would be catastrophic, but I mean, really, really catastrophes before you label something as high impact. So, so just keep that in mind. And so let's go ahead and take about 5 to 7 minutes to determine our impacts. So let's go ahead, no matter where we are in our process, and do our final step in the risk assessment, and that is combining our likelihoods and impacts to see what is our risk level going to be. And so we take the information from those previous tables, and if you scroll down, you can see that there's here in tables I3 or I5 and I7, where we can, and again we have separate tables for adversarial and non-adversarial, and if you know, you can, it's got columns there for just about everything that we've already done in the other tables. So I'm not sure, maybe it would be easier if you're conducting an actual risk assessment to start with a table on the order of the I5 and I7 table, so that you're not doing a lot of transferring. You know, I'm not sure why it was decided to set it up all separately and then transfer all of that information into these tables. But for now, we're not going to take the time to do that, obviously, today. But we do want to make sure we fill out the last column of risk by taking our overall likelihood and our level of impacts that we determined in the previous two steps, and fill out that last column. So, and that's our risk level that we're going to carry forward. So anyway, this table here, I3, is if you've used these scales, the semi-quantitative scales, so it just translates the scale to the high, moderate, or low things, so that you can use table I2, this another one of the same matrix type of tables. So again, if you said your overall likelihood was high, but your impact was moderate, then you're going to come out with moderate risk. And so again, these are the tables. We had some comments, I know, on 30 Grub 1 that some people weren't happy with very low and very high equally low. You know, we had some comments that that should be moderate, and if that's what you feel strongly about, you know, again, you're able to modify these tables. This isn't a law written in stone. You can change these tables, but in any case, let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and come out with our final risk determinations based on our likelihoods and impacts. So just let's be quick about that and only take about no more than 5 minutes.